Hey guys, all right, I'm not in class today because my daughter's sick, so I had to take the day off, but what you guys are going to be doing today is you're going to take out the packet that you took home last night. Last night you were supposed to watch an ed puzzle that went over the first 4 examples in this packet. So if you can turn to the next page, we're going to start on the 5th example. All right, so you know what? Changing plans. What I think I'd like you guys to do is I'd like you to try out, if you are in my 3rd, 5th, or 7th period class, I'd like you to try out examples 5 through 14, and then you could check with the answer key on Google Classroom, and if there's anything that you don't understand through the answer key, I'm going to make a quick video of how to do each of these examples, so just scroll ahead to whatever questions you had trouble with. If you're in my honors class, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing, but I'd like you to do up to number 18. Okay, so if you're in period 8, you're going up to 18. If you're in my other classes, you're going up to number 14. Okay, and then check with the answer key. It's right on Google Classroom. Go into Unit 2 handouts and scroll down until you see answer keys. And anything you got wrong, just watch this video for. Okay, so in number 5, the first thing we want to do is we want to get everything to one side of the equation. So I'm going to take this 3 and move it to the left-hand side of the equation. Now, when I move it over, it becomes a negative number. So I can rewrite this as, as 2x squared plus 5x, right? Those just come down. And when I take this 3 and move it to the left-hand side of the equation, it becomes a minus 3. And then over here, I bring down the equal sign, and there's nothing left, so it equals 0. Remember, in order to start these, you have to have this side of the equation set equal to 0. Okay, so now you're just going to factor. So since there's a number other than 1 in front of the first term, we do the rainbow, which means we bring down the first term, leave a space, and bring down the last term. And you have to come up with 2 numbers that multiply to negative 6 and add to positive 5. So positive 6 and negative 1. So positive 6 and negative 1, but I'm going to attach x's to these because this middle term here has an x. All right, so now we can do grouping. And I'm going to do this a little faster because we're kind of through the factoring unit, and a lot of you guys did a really nice job on it. All right, so I'm going to factor it to 2x, which leaves me with x plus 3. Out of the next 2 terms, it looks like the only thing I can factor out is a negative 1, which also leaves me with x plus 3. And don't forget to bring down the equals 0, okay? You want to keep it in an equation the whole way through. And then I'm going to group together the 2x minus 1 in one parenthesis, and I'll bring down the x plus 3. And keep it in an equation, right? The equals 0. You don't want to forget this. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're just going to solve. I'm going to make what we call a t-chart. And I'm going to set the 2x minus 1 equal to 0, as well as my other factor, the x plus 3. I'm going to set that equal to 0. And then we're just going to solve each of these. So here to solve the left-hand side of the t-chart, I would add 1 to both sides, and then divide by 2. So you can leave this as x equals 1/2 or x equals 0.5, either way. And on this side, I'm going to subtract 3, and that's going to leave me with x equals 3. All right, let's see if I can move this page a little. Here we go, number 6. All right, now for this, the equation's already set equal to 0. So I'm just going to factor. Now here, the first thing I'm going to do is factor out a greatest common factor of x squared, which is going to leave me with x squared minus 18x, and then plus 65. Okay, and then I'll bring down the equals 0. Now, in this parenthesis here, I could factor further, right? I can do the AM method, add, multiply. All right, now we know, the reason I could do that is because there's a 1 in front of our first term. All right, we know when we do that, well, let me bring this down first. We know when we do that, we set up 2 sets of parentheses. And since this is an x squared, I'm going to put an x here and here. And then 2 numbers that multiply to 65 and add to negative 18 would be, let's see, negative 13 and negative 5. Okay, so now when I make my t-chart, you can, set each factor equal to 0, just like we did in the last one if you want. And you could solve these one by one. Okay, now, to solve this first one, right, we have a square on the x. All you have to do is take the square root, so x equals. Now, normally when you take the square root, you would write plus and minus on the side, the positive and the negative, right? Remember, the exponent tells you how many answers you could have. So since this is a 2, we could have up to 2 answers. So if this said, like, if this was a 9 over here, the answer would be positive 3 and negative 3, right? Plus and minus 3. But since the square root of 0 is 0, 0 is not positive or negative. It's a neutral number, right? So we don't have to put the plus and minus in front. So normally where we'd have 2 answers here, we're only going to have 1. Okay, so that's our first answer. Our second answer is going to give us x equals positive 13. And the last one is going to give us x equals 5. Now, I just want to point out, if you want to skip this middle step here and just jump right to the answer, like, and not this middle step, if you don't even want to write any of this out, if, you know, underneath this, if you want to write just x equals 13, and under this x equals 5 and not show any work, I am so okay with that. All right, and now number 7 is a little tricky, and I'm going to say, even though there's only one term on the left-hand side of the equation, I'm going to bring these 2 terms to the left instead of bringing this over, because if this is going to be my first term, I don't want to make it negative. If I move it over here, I'm going to have a negative, and then I got to factor out the -1. It becomes a little harder, right? So it's just easier, in my opinion, to just take these 2 terms and move them to the left. When I move them to the left, this positive 12x squared becomes a negative, and the negative 32 becomes a positive, and then I'm left with nothing on the right-hand side of the equation. Okay, so this is a pretty quick factoring. I mean, since though there's a 1 in front of the x to the 4th, we do not have to do the rainbow. We don't have to, you know, do grouping and all that. We just set up our 2 sets of parentheses. And since the trinomial starts with x to the 4th, I'm going to put x squared in each of these. And then just 2 numbers that add to -12 and multiply to 32. So -8 and -4. Now, some people like to always factor completely, right? If it was a factoring question, you would have to factor completely. But when you're solving an equation, you don't actually have to factor completely to solve it. If you wanted to make a t-chart right here and solve each of these equations individually, you could. If you wanted to factor this further to x plus 2 times x minus 2, you could do that as well. I'm going to do it like this, but I'll show you what would happen if we had factored this further too. Okay, so here, I'm just setting each of these factors equal to 0. Okay, now to solve this, I would add 8 to both sides of the equation. And to get rid of a square, we know we take the square root. All right, now since this is a square, it tells us we could have up to 2 answers. So over here, I'm going to write plus and minus. Now, 8 is not a perfect square. Nothing times itself gives you 8. So when you have a number like that under the radical, you want to rewrite this in the simplest radical form. And you may remember this from Algebra 1. I actually saw Miss Santarella's class doing this last week. So I guess you do it earlier in the year in Algebra 1. But what we do is we break this up into 2 separate radicals. And under the first radical, you want to put the biggest perfect square that divides evenly into 8. So that would be 4, right? And since 4 times 2 gives you 8, we're going to put a 2 in the other radical. All right, now I'm going to bring down the x equals plus and minus. And then since the square root of 4 is 2, we could rewrite this. I'm just going to cross it off and write it on top as 2. Not radical 2, as 2. And then this radical 2 we can't do anything else with, so I'm just going to bring it down. So that gives us 2 plus and minus 2 radical 2. So that's 2 of our answers, positive 2 radical 2 and negative 2 radical 2. Now in this one, we're going to add 4 to both sides. And then when we take the square root, we're again going to have plus and minus. And 4 is a perfect square, right? The square root of 4 is just 2, so we can leave that as a 2. And sorry, this is an equal sign. So we just make that a little neater. All right. So here we wound up with 4 answers, right? Positive 2 radical 2, negative 2 radical 2, plus 2, and minus 2. And the biggest exponent tells you how many answers you're allowed to have. Oh, and by the way, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention. If you had factored this further to x plus 2 times x minus 2, and solved, you would still get these same two answers. All right, number 8. All right, so this one is already set equal to 0 for us. And we have 4 terms where we can't pull out a GCF. So I'm just going to jump right into factoring. All right, so I'm going to group, or I should say jump right into grouping and group. Out of the first 2 terms, I could pull out a 4x squared, which leaves me with 2x plus 1. All right, out of the next 2 terms, I could pull out a negative 9, which is also going to leave me with positive 2x plus 1. And then I'm just going to group what's in front of my common parenthesis together. And I'm going to rewrite that common parenthesis once and once only. All right, and equals 0. Okay, don't forget to keep it in equation. Now here, this can factor further, right? This is dots. So if you want to factor further, you can. Or again, just like the last one, if you want to jump right into making the t-chart, you can. You know, I'll factor this one further. So this one, we're going to make 2x plus 3 and 2x minus 3. Okay, so I just factored this further using dots. And then I'll bring down my 2x plus 1 equals 0. Okay, so when we make a t-chart, I'm going to set each of these factors equal to 0. Okay, so there we go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to solve these individually and see what we get. Okay, so for this first one, I'm going to subtract 3. And then when I'm done, I'm dividing by 2, which gives me x equals negative, it's supposed to be a 3, it doesn't look like one, negative 3/2. Okay, that's my first answer. If you want to write that as negative 1.5, you can do that too. As long as it's a decimal that stops like that, we call that a terminating decimal, you could write it as a decimal. If it's a decimal that keeps going like, whatever, 0.33333, you have to leave it as a fraction. And this one too. 3/2 is 1.5. If you want to write it as a decimal, feel free, because it's a terminating decimal. It comes to an end, it stops. All right, so we're solving all these, and in this case, we get x equals negative 1/2. Okay, so we have 3 answers, 1, 2, 3, and if you look from the beginning, our biggest exponent was a 3. That told us the maximum amount of answers that we were allowed to have. Okay, number 9. So here, there is a greatest common factor, which is negative 5, right? So the reason I'm factoring out a negative is because the first term is negative. Let me change colors here, so we'll go to red. All right, so I'm going to factor out a negative 5, which leaves me with positive y squared plus 3y minus 4. I'm going to bring down the equal 0, and then I'm just going to factor further. So I'm going to set up 2 sets of parentheses, and I'll put a y and a y. And 2 numbers that add to 3 and multiply to negative 4 would be positive 4 and negative 1. Right? This was an easy one. And then when we make a t-chart, we can set each factor equal to 0 and solve. Okay, so let's start here. Negative 5 equals 0. There's no variable to solve for, and negative 5 doesn't equal 0, right? That doesn't make sense. So we know when there's no variable involved in that equation, and these 2 numbers aren't the same, we just cross it off. Okay, under here, when we subtract 4 from both sides, we get y equals negative 4. And then here, when we add 1 to both sides, we get y equals 1. So we end up with these 2 answers. And again, if you want to skip this, if you see y plus 4 and you want to just jump right to y equals negative 4, feel free. Don't forget the equal sign. Sometimes on accident, people see y plus 4 and they write y minus 4. Just remember, this is an equation. This is an equal sign you're solving. Okay, so these are our 2 answers. All right, number 10. So this one, if you want to solve it, by using our factoring techniques, I'm going to show you another way you can do it without doing that. But you can just factor out the greatest common factor, which is 4. And that would leave you with x squared minus 9 equals 0. And then x squared minus 9 is a difference of 2 perfect squares, so it's dots. So I'm going to factor to x plus 3 times x minus 3. And then if you set each factor equal to 0, the first one we write 4 equals 0, which doesn't make sense. 4 doesn't equal 0, so we cross that off. I'm going to start skipping this time. When we see x plus 3, we can write x equals negative 3. And if you see x minus 3, we're going to write x equals positive 3. Okay, so we wound up with these two answers. Now, the other way you could have done it is like this. Okay, you could just basically add 36 to one side of the equation and then divide by 4 and take the square root. And when you do, let me just move this up. Remember, we get x equals positive and negative, right? Because we're solving an equation where this is squared, there could be two answers, positive and negative 3, which is exactly what we got right here. Okay, so this one, because it was missing the middle term, the b term, the term with the x on it, right? You can, if you want, just add the number over and then divide by the number in front of the variable and take the square root. All right, number 11. Okay, so we have to get this equation set equal to 0, so I am going to move this 48x over to the left, and we know when we do, it becomes a negative. Okay, so now I'm going to factor this. Now, I know there's 4 terms, but before we jump into grouping, look, we can pull out a greatest common factor. So I'm going to pull out an x, and that's going to leave me with x cubed plus 4x squared minus 12x minus 48. Okay, now I can do the grouping. So I'm going to group together the first two terms, pull out an x squared, which leaves me with x plus 4. Then out of these two terms, I could pull out a negative 12, which also leaves me with positive x and positive 4. All right, so let me bring the x down, and I'll group together the x squared minus 12. And then I'm going to rewrite this common parenthesis just once. All right, so I can't factor anything further, so I'm just going to jump into my t-chart. So under this first one, I'm going to move this over. Under the first one, I get x equals 0. Okay, set it equal to 0, and there's nothing to solve. That's it. That's my first solution. Under the next one, I'm going to add 12 to both sides of the equation. Okay, that leaves me with x squared equals 12, and then we have to take the square root. So just like we were saying with all the earlier ones, if you have a square, it tells you there could be up to 2 answers. So to account for that, we write plus and minus. You could have a positive answer and a negative answer. And then 12 is not a perfect square, so we're going to break this up into 2 separate radicals. And you want to come up with 2 numbers that multiply to 12, where one of them is the biggest perfect square possible. So 4 times 3. Okay, and then I'm going to bring down my plus and minus. Since the square root of 4 is 2, I'm going to make that a 2. And then I'm going to bring down the radical 3. So I get positive 2 radical 3 and negative 2 radical 3. So in this part of the t-chart, we actually get 2 answers. And then here I'm just going to jump right to the answer. When we see x plus 4, we know that we're going to get the opposite sign. As our x value, we get x equals negative 4. Okay, so these are our 4 answers. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the reason we have 4 answers is because the biggest exponent tells us the maximum number of answers that we're allowed to have. Okay. Number 12. So let's first set the equation equal to 0 by subtracting 8 from both sides of the equation. So we know when we move the 8 to the left-hand side of the equation, it becomes a negative. Okay, and then we're just going to factor this. So since we have a number other than 1 in front of the first term, we're going to do the rainbow. Okay, when we do the rainbow, we bring down our first term, we bring down the last term, and we come up with 2 numbers that multiply to the rainbow number and add to the middle term. Okay, so I guess that would be positive 16 and negative 3. So I'm going to write positive 16p and negative 3p, and then we'll just group. All right, so out of the first 2 terms, I could pull out a 2p, which leaves me with 3p plus 8. Out of the next 2 terms, I could just pull out a negative 1, which leaves me with 3p plus 8. And then I'm going to group together the 2p minus 1, right, what's in front of our common parentheses, and then I'll just bring down the 3p plus 8. And you could just make a t-chart and solve. So when you set each of these factors equal to 0 and solve, you should wind up with two, I guess, fractional solutions. So let's say, so here I can add 1 to both sides of the equation, and then I'm going to divide by 2, leaving me with p equals 1/2. If you want to write that as 0.5, you could do that because it's a decimal that stops, that terminates, right? It has an ending. Right, either one of those answers is fine. Now over here, when I subtract 8 and divide by 3, you get p equals -8/3. This one you can't write. You can't write as a decimal because if you plug in your calculator -8 divided by 3, it'll give you what, -2.66666. It's a decimal that keeps going and going. So you don't want to, stop. You don't want to round it if it doesn't say to round it. You don't want to put a bar on top of it because you could never substitute that back into a problem. So you just leave it as a fraction, -8/3. Okay, number 13. So I first want to get one side of the equation set equal to 0. So in order to do that, I'm going to bring down the x to the 4th. I'm going to move this 29x squared over, and when I do, it becomes a negative. And then I'm going to bring down the plus 100. And don't forget to write equals 0, okay? We moved everything from the right-hand side of the equation, so there's nothing left there. Please make sure you have it in this order where your exponents go in descending order. X to the 4th, x squared, and technically x to the 0, right? There's no x here. Okay, so let's factor. So because there's a 1 in front of our first term, we set up 2 sets of parentheses. We put an x squared to the first spot, in the first spot in each parenthesis, and we come up with two numbers that add to -29 and multiply to 100. So -25 and -4. Now, if you want to make a t-chart at this point, you can, right? You can make a t-chart. You could set each of these equal to 0 and solve. Or if you want to factor further, you can do that too before you make your t-chart. Okay, so this time I'm going to factor further. So this factors to x plus 5 times x minus 5, right? That's dots. And then the second parenthesis here, this is also dots, factors to x plus 2 times x minus 2. And then I'm going to bring down my equals 0. You have to bring down this equals 0 in every single step, or else you get points off, right? You got to keep it in equation. So I'm going to jump right to the answers. Here, I get x equals -5. Right, my solution is going to have the opposite sign of my factor. Here I'm going to have x equals +5, x equals -2, and for my last x that we see, we get x equals +2. Okay, so we have 4 answers, which, since the biggest exponent was a 4, we were thinking that was probably how many we were going to have, unless there was some repetitive answer, which there's not. All right, and then for the regular class, number 14 is the last one that I'm going to go over. For the honors class, I'm not going to go over 15 through 18 in this video. I'm going to have you just look at the answer key, and if you have any questions, I will answer them for you tomorrow. Okay, so number 14, I'm first going to pull out the greatest common factor of x squared, which leaves me with x squared minus 11x plus 18, and I'm going to bring down my equals 0. All right, and then I'm just going to factor what's in the parentheses further. So since there's a 1 in front of our first term, I set up 2 sets of parentheses, and in this case I get an x and an x, and 2 numbers that add to -11 and multiply to positive 18 would be -9 and -2. All right, so we make our t-chart. When I set x squared equal to 0, I would have to take the square root of both sides, leaving me with x equals, square root of 0 is just 0, okay? It doesn't get a positive or a negative, it's just 0. Here, I'm going to get x equals +9, right? My solution has the opposite sign of my factor. Don't forget the equal sign. And then here I get x equals +2. Okay, again, the honors class, I would like you to try 15 through 18 on your own. And then if you have any questions, just look on the answer key and I can go over them with you tomorrow. All right, have a great day, everyone. Don't forget about the homework tonight. There is another Ed puzzle to introduce you to the next part of this packet.